Hello, y'all. Normally I just upload, my music onto here, but being that I'm getting this PhD and studying things that I think you guys will find interesting, potentially, partly because I talk about some of this stuff in the music, I figured that I would begin to talk about some of it on YouTube as well, or, on the internet more broadly. And, it's not going to be anything too serious or overly organized, but obviously I figured I'd just get into it. So today what we're going to talk about is one of these nodes basically within this app I have here. This is basically just a network of, I don't know why they're rotating, but nodes in a kind of system. It's an app called Obsidian. Some of you may be familiar with it. A lot of people are using it to talk about the files and everything, and just keep track of all that sort of stuff. But for the purposes here, it's obviously to do with some of these topics I've covered in my dissertation, and I figured I could more easily talk about some of this stuff that basically is, a little taboo or a little whatever else, to just kind of peripheral to the dissertation. So, I figured this is as good of a place as any. So what you see here basically is a map I've created of nodes relating to different concepts and topics and histories in basically this framework of social control. And social control is just what it sounds like. These are technologies and tools and systems that facilitate controlling people, basically getting them to do things they might not otherwise do. And obviously the social part just means, groups of people, basically. There's other types of control, population control, self-control, all these kinds of things. And they absolutely relate to all this stuff, but social control is sort of the part I focused on with the dissertation. So basically I figured I'd just go through, I've written kind of articles for a lot of these. I'm going to keep writing articles. I'm going to keep just coming up with stuff related to this. And not all of it, like I said, will necessarily relate to the dissertation ultimately. So let's go ahead and get into it. I think the one I want to talk about today is this one that keeps floating away here: colonial policy of co-optation. And I should say too, these lines going between things, it's kind of like a Wikipedia type situation where it's just, if I've referenced something in the article and made a specific note of it, then it will have a line to it. So obviously the thing I'm talking about that has the most references is something like MK Ultra, counterinsurgency, some of these broader topics that tend to relate to everything. Mind fair types is one of these terminologies I was using at the beginning when I first started this network, basically to try to typify what I'm calling now social control technologies. And we can talk more about that another time, but I'll go ahead and get into it in terms of the co-optation policy. So what we're looking at here is basically this idea of essentially, what else has been, or what's been called otherwise elite capture. And we'll talk about that in a moment as well. And this is discussed in the book by, I want to say his name is Thomas Allen, but I could be getting the first name wrong. But he has a book called The Invention of the White Race. And he basically looks at the history of the Irish people and how they were treated, and, makes some interesting claims about it, about sort of race and prerequisites to race in British colonialism, in Ireland. And I found that really interesting because obviously, it's one side of understanding this thing. But obviously on the other side, we have the understanding that, some Irish people, a fair portion of them participated in the slave trade, particularly, when you talk about the Caribbean and Jamaica and places like that. But of course, that doesn't change the fact that the British were treating them the way they were, and they dealt with their own kind of, colonial struggle and counterinsurgency and things of that nature. So this particular node of colonial co-optation as a strategy of social control speaks about the social policy or strategy, like I said, which seeks to divide and conquer through specifically co-optation of certain segments of an oppressed or colonized group in order to create a buffer class. And that could be economic or social buffer class, or, a sort of class that thinks of themselves differently even. This functioned through the colonies, including the United States, with the prevalence of the one-drop rule kind of, in Louisiana and Virginia and elsewhere as a sort of exception, because it brought in this apparent buffer class into, the group that was outcast, in this case, Black Americans or African Americans, Negroes. So obviously that's slightly different from the co-optation strategy that we see in other colonial contexts, such as in, say, Uganda or something, where they brought in Indians. So Bacon's Rebellion, which happened in Virginia near Jamestown and Williamsburg, marked a turning point in the clarity of English colonial governance in terms of the need to maintain some divisions between the lower classes. The same logic is used to internally divide the classes at several points, which we see with this whole mulatto light skin, Creole maroon, poor whites versus enslaved Negroes, elite capture, ghetto informant program later during COINTELPRO, and this whole concept of sellouts and Uncle Toms and so on. So in a section within the Invention of the White Race book, Allen makes the argument that presumably with his mind to the one-drop rule, quote, the history of the United States, he claims, has no parallels to that of Ireland, where eventually the British ruling class found it necessary to draw the Irish Catholic bourgeoisie into the intermediate social control stratum, and thus to end racial oppression except in Ulster. Though he goes on to make the interesting comparison that a different parallel could be found in the British West Indies, so-called, I would argue, in fact, that there's long existed a tried and true method of liberal racial social control in the United States, which sought to effect similar ends for African Americans through co-optation, or elite capture. So in Virginia, we find the makings of this policy and its trappings, which is so often ignored in kind of political science and studies on race. But obviously, Black nationalists have paid closer attention to this reality, which I'll talk about later, in another video. But it should be said that Virginia is also home to many, many efforts to try to grapple with these complex realities of racial social control and warfare under enslavement and after enslavement. So, as we'll also see, owing to the legal, political, and social control institutions in Virginia at the time and afterward, the family and domestic space were seen as points of refuge where enslaved Africans found themselves best able to carve out their freedom and a social identity. As many people have pointed out, the last bastion or refuge of safety needed to be protected. So for this reason, obviously, something like the Garvey movement, which came into Virginia much later, and not many people know about that. Obviously, we tend to talk about places like Harlem and maybe even Florida. But the second largest chapter of the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, that Marcus Garvey created, was in Newport News, Virginia, actually. So, as of around 1919 or the 1920s or so. So in the modern era, this co-optation concept takes many forms. A similar concept is the agent cultivation or asset recruitment tactic that you see from spies and foreign governments. And it can be understood as a sort of outgrowth of early counterinsurgency technologies and war technologies. These are pretty much ancient technologies that get lost, they get remembered, they get reimagined throughout time. And the goal here is to sort of keep track of some of these things. Another name for this that you might see looking online, trying to read about it, is clandestine human, which is human intelligence asset recruiting. Human intelligence is a contrast to something like SIG, signals intelligence, where you're taking information from, satellites and things like that. So in the future, we might talk about some of these other aspects that I just mentioned, but today that's really all I wanted to get into just to get started. So thank y'all. And, if you see anything on this whole broader map that you want to talk about or hear me talk about, just let me know in the comments. I'm going to just keep making these videos regardless, but, zoom in, see what you see, if anything interests you, and we'll check it out.